Once upon a time Christ lived, we discussed a sensational discovery by the authors of the New Chronology, Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nozovsky. After years of deep research, these scientists established that the earthly life of Jesus Christ should not be dated to the 1st century AD but rather to the 12th century. This discovery necessitates a complete re-evaluation of not only the chronology of human life but also the entirety of world history. Fomenko and Nozovsky, having studied hundreds of ancient documents, concluded that not only do the dates of most historical events need revision, but so do their locations. Traditional history assures us that all historical facts have long been verified and need no further proof of authenticity. However, this is not always the case. For example, when studying one of humanity's most important documents, the Bible, Fomenko and Nozovsky discovered that the Jerusalem described in the Old and New Testaments is not the modern city of Jerusalem. In ancient times, there was a kingdom called Judah, and its capital was Jerusalem. Modern historians and archaeologists claim this kingdom was located in Southwest Asia, where the state of Israel is today, with Jerusalem as its capital. Biblical history scholars assert that ancient Jerusalem and modern Jerusalem are the same city. But why are scientists so sure that the ancient Jews lived precisely on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea and not elsewhere? Let's examine the facts. Jerusalem, the capital of Israel, is a sacred place for Christians, Muslims, and Jews. Christians believe it was here that Solomon's temple was built, Jesus Christ was crucified, and Muslims believe the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven. Thousands of tourists and pilgrims visit annually, yet many are disappointed by the lack of authentic biblical evidence. Tour guides openly admit that the city's churches and houses were built much later than the events described in the Bible. For instance, plaques on some houses state they were built in the 14th or 15th centuries. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, a major Christian shrine, was constructed in the 19th century during the Napoleonic era, when European forces first entered Palestine, defeating Turkish troops. Today, the church built in the 19th century is claimed to have replaced an older one, yet no ancient churches from biblical times can be found in modern Jerusalem. Moreover, Golgotha, the site of Christ's crucifixion, is today marked only by the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The geographical features described in the Gospels, such as mountains, are absent. An examination of Jerusalem's ancient parts reveals no biblical traces except for names, which only resurfaced in the 19th century with the arrival of European archaeologists. Surprisingly, 200 years ago, there was no Jerusalem here, just a small Palestinian village. So, why do historians insist that ancient Jews lived where modern Israel is located? Their main evidence comes from the field of biblical archaeology, which seeks artifacts related to biblical events. Despite being a relatively young science, about 200 years old, archaeologists and historians believe they have found enough evidence to place ancient Judea and modern Israel. However, indisputable evidence is still lacking. American scientist Edward Robinson first began studying Palestine, making trips in 1838 and 1852. It is widely believed that during his first visit, Robinson examined the ancient city's walls, although this claim is dubious, considering earlier records from the 15th century. Research on Rousseau's topography was clearly documented, and links to these books can be found at Pulleys. It is well known that the direction of Jerusalem's walls was not determined, nor was the exact location of Jerusalem's walls known or employed by archaeologists. Sheikh, one of the first to attempt to identify biblical names, ruins, temples, and holy places in the terrain, struggled for a long time. It took a significant effort to map these biblical names onto Jerusalem's territory. Another famous English archaeologist, John Wright, worked for many years on excavations in Palestine. He frankly admitted that most of his findings proved nothing. 200 years later, nothing has changed. Irrefutable evidence has never been found by archaeologists, but many pseudo-finds or outright fakes have appeared. For example, the so-called King Solomon's tablets were supposedly found in a trash heap near the Temple Mount, and the ossuary, a stone box allegedly containing the remains of Jesus Christ's brother, James, turned out to be fake. This ossuary was exhibited in Canada at the Royal Museum in Ontario, where 100,000 people viewed it, many treating it as a shrine. Only years later did it become known as a forgery. Currently, the High Court of Jerusalem is hearing a case about possibly falsified finds, including the ossuary of the Apostle James. I provided testimony for 5 hours, stating that I found the ossuary unconvincing, believing that part of the inscription was added later. My criteria for evaluating each find and situation revealed a huge disharmony in this case, leading me to conclude the inscription was not authentic. How many more fake biblical artifacts are stored in museums and private collections? Many finds suspected to be fake were probably part of a forgery scheme by a group of scammers who operated in Jerusalem from the late 60s to the early 90s, forging seals and other artifacts. For instance, a pomegranate displayed in a museum is an original find, but its inscription is fake. Perhaps some archaeological finds in modern Israel are genuinely ancient but fail to prove anything. As English archaeologist Wright suggested, maybe traces of ancient Jerusalem should be sought elsewhere. For 200 years, scientists and archaeologists have failed to find evidence that Jews lived on the Mediterranean coast. Yet, historians continue to insist that this ancient country was located here. Why? Possibly ancient maps and manuscripts suggest this, or maybe the area perfectly matches biblical descriptions. But the biblical book of Deuteronomy describes a fertile land with streams, springs, lakes, wheat, barley, vines, fig trees, pomegranate trees, oilseed trees, and honey, a description very different from the barren land of modern Israel. It's hard to imagine that this land once had wheat fields, vineyards, and deep rivers. If this really happened, why did the fertile land become a desert? While natural or man-made disasters could cause changes, historians have no evidence of such events resulting in significant climatic or geophysical changes. The city known today as Jerusalem never had streams, springs, or lakes. It is located in the mountains with several water sources tens of kilometers away, resulting in perennial water scarcity. It is odd that people chose such an unsuitable place for a city. All known ancient cities were built near water, as rivers and seas were natural transport routes and sources of food. Jerusalem, however, is an exception, located far from large sources of fresh water and 50 kilometers from the sea. In many medieval paintings, Jerusalem is depicted by a wide river or strait, with clearly visible high hills, tall and leafy trees. This image of Jerusalem was typical in the Middle Ages. Artists did not portray Christ crucified in a desert, they likely knew what the real Jerusalem looked like. Additionally, these paintings often show people around the cross wearing warm coats and fur hats, clothing more suitable for a colder climate rather than a desert. Historians argue that this was just the artistic convention of the time to depict gospel events. However, the Bible itself suggests a colder climate for Jerusalem. For instance, the Ostro Bible in the book of Ezra mentions, all the people gathered in Jerusalem within 3 days. In the 9th month, on the 20th day of the month, and all the people sat in the open square before the house of God, trembling because of this matter and because of the heavy rain. This passage indicates a frosty winter with snow, which is absent in later Bible editions. Moreover, there are other written sources that provide insights into the location of Judea. Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nozovsky, after determining that Christ's earthly life was in the 12th century AD, focused on medieval documents. Educated people in the Middle Ages believed that the center of the world was where they were. The historian Leo Deakin in the 10th century described the Byzantine Emperor Nikephoros II Phocas's journey to the Blessed Land at the center of the world, also called Palestine, which was described as flowing with milk and honey. At that time, the center of the world was depicted on geographical maps with Jerusalem placed at the center. This can be seen, for example, on a map by King 100 from 1480. These maps were more like beautiful drawings than modern maps, but they depicted Jerusalem at the center. During the Middle Ages, most people had a vague idea of the exact location of the Holy City, especially before the printing press made it possible to create a large number of similar geographical maps and books. Even with the development of cartography, Jerusalem was still seen as distant and inaccessible. Thus, calling Jerusalem the center of the world was likely meant in a religious rather than geographical sense. Each Christian country or community wanted to have its own Jerusalem, making it a religious and political center. If the religious center moved, the name Jerusalem moved with it. Fomenko and Nozovsky, after studying many medieval geographical maps and the Bible, discovered that the Jerusalem described in the New Testament is not the modern Jerusalem in Israel, but a different city. This city was located on the shore of the Bosphorus Strait, about 30 kilometers from the central part of modern Istanbul. They found that this ancient city and nearby areas matched the description of the biblical Jerusalem and the famous Golgotha, where Jesus was crucified. Today, this mountain in Turkey is called Kariye Hill or Beykoz Hill. According to the Gospels, Mount Calvary, the site of Jesus Christ's crucifixion, was near Jerusalem. When historians in the 18th and 19th centuries decided that the ancient Jerusalem was the Palestinian village of Al-Quds, they naturally started looking for Golgotha there. However, they found no mountains matching the description. Eventually, they identified a small hill as Golgotha, although it did not resemble the biblical account. South of the fortress, there is a mountain that closely resembles Golgotha. This mountain is the highest on the upper Bosphorus, with an elevation of 180 meters above sea level. An old Turkish historical book, History Code, by Wisht Assad, describes ancient Constantinople and mentions that it was located in the suburbs of Harabey Kas, where there is an ancient grave known as the Grave of Joshua. Historians consider this grave to be the resting place of Joshua, the leader of the Jews and successor to Moses, whose deeds are described in the Old Testament book of Joshua. However, the exact reason why Joshua would be buried in Turkey is unclear, even to historians and Muslim clergy. The Turks acknowledge that there are at least 3 other graves purported to be Joshua's in Nablus, part of Palestinian autonomy, Syria, and Gaza Antibes in southern Turkey. This makes it unlikely that this site is the actual burial place of the biblical Joshua. Fomenko and Gleb Nozovsky argue that this is not a grave but a symbolic place. They suggest it marks the site of Jesus Christ's crucifixion. The site features a flat, rectangular earthen elevation surrounded by a high cast iron grate covered with an iron net to prevent pilgrims from touching the ground. Inside the fence, there are dense grasses and tall trees. At the ends of the grave are 2 round cylindrical stones with a quadrangular hole in one and a distinct crack in the other. This area is enclosed by a high stone wall with 2 doors and several windows. Comparing this with the 12th century notes of monk Daniel, who described Golgotha during his pilgrimage as a high stone with a carved well at the top and a surrounding wall with 2 doors, there are striking similarities. The high round stone with a hole at the top and a visible crack, along with a surrounding wall and 2 doors, closely match Daniel's description. The coincidence is striking, but why is this site called a grave? The site is too large to be a real grave and is likely symbolic. Fomenko and Nozovsky believe it marks the crucifixion site of Jesus Christ. Local residents also report that at the foot of the mountain are 3 more huge stones, possibly symbolizing the tombs of the apostles or Jesus Christ. Additionally, many medieval paintings, icons, and frescoes depict the crucifixion against the backdrop of a large sea, strait or wide river, indicating that artists believe the actual location to be near such a body of water. This is unlike the modern Jerusalem, which lacks such features. There is no Jerusalem in the traditional sense, but there are mountains in the vicinity. One such mountain, located on the Asian coast of the Bosphorus, offers a clear view of the European coast across the strait. The discovery of Golgotha was the first significant find by Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nozovsky in this ancient land. This mountain played a crucial role in their search for Jerusalem, where they first saw the ruins of ancient Rosso. Traditional history asserts that Constantinople, now Istanbul, was built in the 4th century AD. However, according to Fomenko and Nozovsky, the city on the European bank of the Bosphorus didn't appear until the 14th century AD. Ignoring the school-taught chronology, this seems logical when considering Istanbul's strategic location at the Bosphorus's entrance to the Sea of Marmara. This site is ideal for controlling ship passage to and from the Black Sea, requiring long-range guns and deep-draft ships, which only appeared in the 14th century. Without them, controlling the Bosphorus would have been impossible, making the earlier construction of the city impractical. It would have been more logical to build near the narrow parts of the strait to control it fully. The Bosphorus has 2 such narrow places. In Constantinople, the strait's width is 700 meters, and in another place, it is 900 meters. On the Asian shore of the strait, at the narrower section, another medieval city, Eurasia, was built several centuries before Constantinople. In their previous works, Fomenko and Nozovsky thought the original Saban was where Tsargrad, Istanbul, is now. However, descriptions of Christ's procession from Jerusalem to Golgotha in the Gospels do not mention crossing any large water bodies like the Bosphorus, a significant obstacle. The walk from Istanbul to the Spit, even after crossing the Bosphorus, is about 25 kilometers, a considerable distance. Their research continued, and Gleb Nozovsky eventually saw an interesting reproduction of an old engraving depicting Mount Ears and a distant old city on a high hill. This place seemed suitable for the ancient Jerusalem's location. What they found exceeded their expectations. They discovered the ruins named Rosso, confirming their theories. The evidence of Christ's earthly life, which archaeologists sought in Palestine, was found near Istanbul at Mount Ears. This biblical Golgotha, unlike Constantinople, did not survive to modern times and lies in ruins on a high hill at the Bosphorus and Black Sea confluence. Historians debate the fortress's construction date, with some believing it existed before the Byzantine period and others suggesting it was built in the 12th century to protect Constantinople from Viking raids. The ancient city's name, likely Jerusalem, is evident from its abbreviation, Iris or Raz, used by Greeks and Russians until the 17th century when Patriarch Nikon's church reform standardized the pronunciation to Jerusalem. This city might have been the first capital of the Byzantine Empire, known in the Middle Ages as the Jewish Kingdom. The Greeks called it Raz, and the Russians pronounced and wrote it as Jerusalem through U. 300 years later, the Byzantine Empire decided to build a new capital at the site of Old Jerusalem, the fortress of Eurasia, on the northern end of the Bosphorus. However, it was no longer suitable for the capital due to the absence of piers for large ships, as more powerful fortifications were needed for the emerging larger ships and artillery. The area where the city of Rosso was located became increasingly unsuitable by the late 14th century due to limited space. Consequently, on the opposite side of the Bosphorus Strait, Constantinople emerged, taking over not only the capital functions but also the name Jerusalem. Fomenko and Nosovsky believe that the events described in the Gospel, including the crucifixion of Jesus Christ in 1185, occurred in this region. If biblical Jerusalem was indeed on the shores of the Bosphorus Strait, this strait would correspond to the Jordan River described in the Bible. Interestingly, the Bosphorus has sometimes been referred to as a river. The biblical text states that the Jordan River flowed from north to south, dividing the ancient territory into western and eastern shores. The West Bank, described as the Promised Land flowing with milk and honey, aligns well with the European side of the Bosphorus, characterized by the fertile Balkans. In contrast, the eastern shore, described as rocky and arid, corresponds to Asia Minor. The modern Jordan River in Israel does not fit this biblical description. It originates from the Golan Heights and flows into the Dead Sea, which has always been a lake. The Jordan River does not divide the country into two climatic zones. Instead, Israel and Jordan share similar climates that do not match the Promised Land's description. The Bible mentions the Jordan River dozens of times, emphasizing its significant and sometimes strategic importance, such as needing special crossings and fighting over these crossings. For example, in the first book of Kings, Jonathan and his men crossed the Jordan River, highlighting its strategic importance. The Bosphorus Strait, which spans about 700 meters at its narrowest point, fits this description well. It is much more plausible that people would have used ships to cross it, as described in the second book of Kings. Furthermore, the Bible describes miraculous events involving the Jordan River, such as the water stopping to allow the Israelites to cross on dry land, resembling the freezing of a river into ice. However, meteorological history shows that the modern Jordan River has never frozen. In contrast, the Bosphorus has frozen multiple times, with records from Byzantine, Arab, and Western European chronicles describing severe frosts that turned the strait into dry land, making it possible to walk across. This analysis by Fomenko and Nosovsky supports the idea that the Bosphorus Strait, rather than the modern Jordan River, fits the biblical descriptions and geographical context. Therefore, it is not surprising that the priests stood in the middle of the Jordan as if on dry land. Further, in the book of Joshua, it states, Jesus called 12 people who were appointed from the sons of Israel, one man from each tribe. Jesus said to them, "Go to the middle of the Jordan and take from there each a stone according to the number of the tribes of the children of Israel, that they may serve as a sign among you." To understand what kind of stones are being referred to, we can look at the Bosphorus. About 200 meters from the Asian coast, opposite the city center, there is a small island in the middle of the strait with the Maiden's Tower. According to legend, a chapel once stood here in honor of the baptism of the Savior, and a cross was erected. It is likely that from this holy place in the middle of the river, the priests took 12 stones to commemorate the harsh winter and the frozen Bosphorus, or Jordan. The geographical location and nature of these lands align closely with the biblical description of Judah and Jerusalem. Are there any ancient monuments here that could materially support Fomenko and Nosovsky's version? The authors of the New Chronology believe such monuments do exist. In the very center of the Turkish capital stands the majestic Cathedral of St. Sophia. Historians claim it was built in the 6th century AD under Emperor Justinian. However, Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nosovsky identify this cathedral with the famous Temple of Solomon built in ancient Jerusalem. This idea emerged from their research into the antiquity of the Hagia Sophia using methods of mathematics and statistics. They discovered overlaps between the history of the 6th century Byzantine kings, Saul and David, and the era of Solomon. Fomenko and Nosovsky argue that the Temple of Solomon, identified with Hagia Sophia, was not built in the 6th century AD but in the 16th century, over 1,000 years later. This construction timeline fits their chronological version, suggesting the temple was built after the capital moved from Old Jerusalem, Rosso, to New Jerusalem, Constantinople. Detailed study of the Hagia Sophia supports this, indicating it was constructed no earlier than the 14th century AD. One key point is that the cathedral shows no signs of settlement. All buildings, especially large ones like the Hagia Sophia, typically sink over time. To prevent damage, door and window openings need to be shifted and lifted. Although the cathedral's walls are plastered, in areas where the plaster has worn away, there are no signs of resettlement. Historians argue that the ancient builders made an exceptionally good foundation. For example, Turkish historian Celal Asad wrote that the Hagia Sophia was built on a square base, each side measuring 75 meters. The foundation was laid on a network of vaults covered with a layer of homogeneous concrete 25 feet thick, which is almost 8 meters. Indeed, based on this foundation, even a majestic building like the Hagia Sophia can avoid sinking. Today, the edges of this concrete foundation can be seen in excavations at the entrance to the cathedral. But could such a powerful concrete foundation really have been constructed by builders in the 6th century? Another interesting fact is that in the 16th century, brick extensions were added around the cathedral to strengthen it. The problem was that the enormous dome, built for the first time, began to press heavily on the arches, crushing the building. To prevent this, the so-called buttresses, brick wings, were attached to support the structure and stop the dome from collapsing. These buttresses had to be added shortly after the initial construction, not 1,000 years later, as the building would have needed them immediately to hold the dome through numerous earthquakes. The old part of Istanbul is filled with large mosques similar in size and architecture to the Hagia Sophia, built in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. According to traditional history, Byzantine builders in the 6th century built the Hagia Sophia but did not replicate this architectural achievement until 1,000 years later. This delay is strange because any successful advancement in human knowledge is typically applied immediately. A question arises: why would the Ottoman Turks, who were Muslims, build such a majestic Christian temple? It is known that the Hagia Sophia was originally Christian. According to Fomenko and Nozovsky's New Chronology, the religious divide between Orthodoxy and Islam began only in the 15th century and ended in the 17th century. Therefore, it is not surprising that in the 16th century, a Christian cathedral was built in Constantinople, Jerusalem. If Hagia Sophia is the real Solomon's temple, there should be another significant building nearby associated with it. The Bible mentions that Hiram, the builder of Solomon's temple, constructed a grand structure filled with water next to the temple. Opposite the Hagia Sophia is one of Istanbul's oldest monuments, the Basilica Cistern. In ancient Constantinople, there was little natural fresh water, so an aqueduct was built to bring water from the Belgrade Forest, 19 kilometers away. This water was stored in underground reservoirs for use during sieges. The Basilica Cistern, or temple reservoirs, was built with 336 columns in 12 rows, possibly symbolizing the 12 shafts mentioned in the Bible. The term columns or shafts could be related to old construction terminology, where supports are still called bulls. Josephus, in his Jewish Antiquities, tells a story about Jerusalem's cistern. One winter, a lion accidentally fell into the tank through a narrow, snow-covered hole and began to roar loudly. Someone passing by heard the roar, went down into the tank, and killed the lion with a blow. This story indicates large underground reservoirs and describes a snowy winter in Jerusalem, providing further evidence that it was quite cold in Jerusalem during winter. Istanbul is home to ancient monuments that witness the region's true history, one of which is the Galata Tower. Standing 61 meters tall with a diameter of 9 meters, and reaching 140 meters above sea level, the tower is visible from almost every point in the city's central part. Built in the 14th century, it was initially called the Tower of Christ. The Galata Tower derives its name from the area in which it is located. Today, Galata is a district in Istanbul. In the Middle Ages, it was a suburb of Constantinople. The Byzantine capital's central part referred to the residents of this suburb as Galatians. Historians recognize these residents as the Gauls, who settled in modern-day Turkey supposedly before the Byzantine Empire's emergence. However, historians do not typically connect these ancient settlers with the medieval Galatians, whom the famous Epistle to the Galatians by St. Paul addressed. If this connection is accurate, it implies that Paul's letters suggest that Christ was crucified in the presence of the Galatians. In the Synodal Bible, Paul's words read, "O foolish Galatians, who hath bewitched you, that ye should not obey the truth, before whose eyes Jesus Christ hath been evidently set forth, crucified among you." Galatians 3:1. The Greek word proograph used in this context translates to publicly portrayed or exposed. In Russian translations, the phrase as if was added, altering the meaning to imply that Paul was speaking to people who could only imagine the crucifixion. Interestingly, in Galata, a church dedicated to St. Paul was built at the beginning of the 13th century. Historians might argue that Paul could have addressed Galatians living in other regions like the Dardanelles and the northwestern Black Sea area, but it is known that the Galatians never lived in Palestine. In our film, we frequently quote the Bible, known to have several translations from Hebrew to Russian, Latin, and English. While these texts are generally consistent, some details differ. For example, the book of Obadiah mentions the migration of the sons of Israel from Jerusalem. Verse 20 includes the word Sepharad, which in Russian translations appears as Sepharad. It reads, "And the exiles of this host of the people of Israel shall possess the land of the Canaanites as far as Zarephath, and the exiles of Jerusalem who are in Sepharad shall possess the cities of the Negeb." In Latin and some English Bibles, Sepharad is not translated, maintaining the original term. This suggests that ancient Jerusalem might have been located on the Bosphorus. This would explain why the Crusaders, who set out to conquer Jerusalem in Palestine, ended up in Byzantium and captured Constantinople. The primary goal of the Crusades was Constantinople, and it is clear that ancient maps and engravings point to Istanbul on the Bosphorus as their destination, rather than a Palestinian Jerusalem. Fomenko and Nozovsky's research shows that the Crusades' timeline, starting 1,000 years after Christ's crucifixion, seems illogical. In a previous film, we discussed how Christ was born in 1152 and crucified in 1185 AD, challenging the traditional historical chronology. The Crusades took place soon after recent events, contrary to the traditional view that there were 4 major crusades. Historians traditionally list them as occurring in 1189 and 1204. However, historical documents suggest that the Crusades aimed to punish and execute those responsible for Christ's crucifixion. According to this interpretation, the Crusaders believed they were acting against the executioners of Christ, with the events occurring in their own time, rather than 1,000 years earlier. This interpretation, often dismissed by historians as mere associations or memories, challenges the traditional timeline, which places about 1,000 years between Christ's crucifixion and the Crusades. While this film only touches on some of the discoveries made by Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nozovsky in their study of biblical history, even these examples suggest that the history of ancient Jerusalem has been greatly distorted, along with a broader history of ancient and medieval humanity. Today, we can confidently assert that the timeline of Christ's earthly life and the location of Jerusalem align perfectly with other events in world history, which will be explored in our upcoming films. According to the biblical text, Jerusalem was destroyed by the troops of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar and then rebuilt. However, the Bible does not specify that Jerusalem was rebuilt in the same location. Scholars of the New Chronology have determined the actual location of Jerusalem as described in the biblical book of Nehemiah. More details on this can be found in our next film, The Moscow Kremlin.